welcome to another episode of Unbound, the podcast about breaking what breaks us and remembering what binds us. My name is Kiki Lindenau, and before we begin, I invite you to soften your mind and open your heart. To listen, not to reply, but to connect. And to remember that staying human is a radical act. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back to another episode of the Unbound podcast. Last weekend was International Women's Day, and as many other people, I went out into the streets of Paris and marched alongside my sisters and brothers and everybody standing for women's rights. And it was such a beautiful reminder of having a community of people fighting for the same fight. And at the same time, it was such a stark reminder for why we still are not where we need to be. You look at the news and the world is literally on fire. Bombs are being dropped all around. Innocent civilians are being murdered. The media is tearing us apart into different extremes. And I just can't help to wonder, where did we go wrong? The world couldn't always have been this violent. And so after my last episode that I published with Sarah, it's actually one of the first ones I recorded, and it sent me into a new direction of studying. And then taking the episode that I published before that on systems, I asked myself, what is the system that is upholding this? And I started doing a lot of research on the patriarchy. And something interesting that this allowed me to ask is, what if domination is the source of all evil? Because I started doing some research into matriarchy, and I'm in a study club right now where we do these readings to figure out an alternative for our future. For 97% of our time as humans on this earth, we lived in egalitarian societies. Patriarchy has only existed for 3% of our time. And yet we see it as normal, like it's our system. That's just how it is. That's what we live in. So I went and I did some research. I read a book called The Creation of the Patriarchy by Gerda, and I wanted to share a little bit of those findings of what I learned with you. The more conversations I've been having with people that I've met through this podcast and through my social media, which is really cool that I get to meet so many smart people who have really radical ideas. And with radical, to me, it sounds like such a negative word because it's used to say like all of the extremists, but it really just means grasping things by the root. That is where the word comes from. That is what the word means. And I think at this point in our system, we need to grab the things by the root, because otherwise we're just going to keep putting band-aids on the problem and not actually fix the problem. I'm learning more and more that all of these systems of exploitation are connected. They share the same underlying logic, that one person is an object and another is the subject that controls the object. This led me to the book, because we always talk about the patriarchy. And I also asked my community on Instagram what patriarchy meant for them. And for me, I didn't really know how to describe patriarchy. It was men getting paid more than women. Women not being able to walk at night in the streets without fearing for their lives. It's femicides every single day. It's violence against women. That's kind of what patriarchy meant for me. But now I understand that it's actually way bigger than that. It's a whole structural thing, a domination by male over the subordinated females that needs violence to continue, which to me is an indicator that it's not natural, because if it were natural, it would just be like that. We have low tide and high tide because that's nature, right? We're not doing anything to continue having these natural phenomena. Whereas the patriarchy needs violence to be upheld. So it can't be natural. So then I read the book. It was published in 1986 by an Austrian-American historian called Gerda Lerner. And she says exactly this. The patriarchy is not natural, but it was built across 2,500 years. So she goes and does a historical analysis of this time span in Mesopotamia, which is the cradle of civilization. It's now the Middle East, even though you're not supposed to say that anymore. I just learned the new word for it. I forgot. I'm aware of the colonial language that I'm using. I'm going to take time and Google it and use it correctly from next time on. But her point, and there are a lot of people who agree with this, like this is not research that is out of the ordinary, that with the agricultural revolution, societies changed from being egalitarian to hierarchical. because there was land to be owned, there was property to be owned, and for it to be passed down to the next generation, the first thing that had to be governed was women's reproductive capability, right? In order to know who the father of a child is, that woman could only have one possible partner, because otherwise you wouldn't know who the son is that you could pass your heritage onto. And so what Gerda argues is that it wasn't with property, but already beforehand, because already before the agricultural revolution, women would be captured as slaves. So let's say two groups are fighting, and then the winning group would take the children and women from the other group captive and basically use them for reproduction, because then their workforce and their defensive force would be stronger, and so they would have a better chance of winning. And with that, men learned to dominate women. And now this then gives rise to a historical development of domination, because before that people were egalitarian. And then with the control of women's bodies, which is needed for a father to pass down his heritage. Because if we lived in a matrilineal society, the men wouldn't be that important. If I had a child, I would pass my lineage down through that child. I know whether that is my child or not. It came out of me. Whereas with the father, it's not that easy to know. So we need to control women's bodies in order to assure that they only have one partner and that they stay loyal to that partner and produce his children, and that way pass on his heritage. So then women became a sort of currency, and they were traded by fathers into arranged marriages for societal benefits. So let's say there were two groups that were at war. This way they could make peace. Women became the first property, and their reproductive capacity became a form of currency controlled by men. It's interesting because in her analysis, she goes into the legal text and everything, and you literally have legal texts proving this. There are laws that governed this. So women weren't just oppressed, they were structurally positioned as objects of exchange between male subjects. So we have a clear hierarchy between men and women. When we go look at the mainstream theories of why patriarchy exists, it's like the man, the hunter theory of the male went out and hunted and was the primary supplier of food. But when we actually look at history and take into account the female version of history, because history was written by elite men, so they only tell their side of the story. So we're missing 50% of what happened, right? How are we ever properly going to understand history if we don't take into account female perspectives? Not a feminist question, like literally. If I only tell you half of the story, how are you ever going to know the entire story? It doesn't make sense. But if we look at the full history, also taking into account women's perspectives, then the majority of food actually from gathering activities, and women did those. So then the argument of the husband being the prime provider doesn't make any sense. That theory has been refuted. As society becomes more patriarchal, first sort of in the home, governed by marriages, then it gets institutionalized legally, and then we have an additional layer, which is religion. When you look at early mythologies, a lot of the figures are female, which, if you think about it, it makes sense. Like, you're trying to make sense of life. The giver of life is a woman. So what she found in this book is that as patriarchy installed itself in the social structures, the religious structures changed. Because with the establishment of a monotheistic religion, that means one God, and the first of those was Judaism. So in the Hebrew texts, you now all of a sudden have one male God, and you have to obey this God in order to get the promises of protection and whatnot. So there we see the mirroring of patriarchy in society, in families, in communities, in governance, translated into a cultural idea of religion that reinforces that societal structure. And then we move further along in time, and we get to the Greeks and the Romans, and for example Aristotle and philosophy, which today informs a huge part of Western thinking, which, by the way, Judaism does as well, right? It's the basis for Christianity and Islam. So it's naturally kind of follows that pattern. And anything that is built on these basics are not going to be in a completely different structure. So they follow the patriarchal logic of male domination and female subordination. But basically what Aristotle and others did is that they added a level of intellectual legitimacy where men were better at political thought and rational thought and leadership, whereas actually women were just never given the opportunity to be in those spaces. So when you then ask them a question, obviously they're not going to know how to do it. If you now asked me, oh, how do you, I don't know, something with biology and chemistry, I would have no idea because I haven't been exposed to that. But that doesn't mean that women in general would then be worse at that. But that's kind of the logic that they used. And so they gave intellectual legitimacy to these political institutions and religious institutions that had been developed over decades before that. Basically, all of these structures together reinforced one another and created a net of male dominance that we now see as divine, as natural, because that's the way things have always been, because we only write about the male perspective. And what it also does, it informs the way that we see ourselves inside of the system and our position. If women are always told your role is to be at home and you're inferior, how are you going to challenge that? And especially if it's so complex. Like, this is a super complex net. And I think we see, if you haven't listened to my episode on systems, I really recommend that you do that, because I go exactly into this detail of systems that are interlinked with one another, that are reinforcing one another. And it's not by chance the outcomes that we see in today's world. It's all because of these systems. I do want to end with something a bit more positive, because if patriarchy has a beginning, it can have an end. And I truly believe that everybody suffers under the patriarchy, because this logic of domination was then translated into other spheres. It's our domination over nature. It's class struggle. It's racial struggles. It's the idea that one person can dominate another person. And our entire world is built on that. And in my opinion, our entire world is being destroyed at that. But we need to remind ourselves that none of this is inevitable. It is historically constructed. And if something can be constructed, it can be deconstructed. So I am now on a mission to find out, how do we deconstruct? And I invite you to follow my Substack, because I'm working on an essay about exactly this at the moment. And then what do we do instead? What would it look like to not have hierarchy? Which is incredibly difficult to imagine, because it's so deeply embedded in our brains and in the way that we think that somebody has to dominate. And after my conversation with Sarah, where we talked about the matriarchy, I started doing more research on it. And it's basically, you can picture matriarchy versus patriarchy, because they sound like they're the opposite. And technically, you could think that matriarchy is women on top leading, but really it means mothers first. So it's matrilineal, as in lineage, heritage is passed on through the mother. Picture a spiral, and you have the children and elders and the most vulnerable in the middle, and then everybody else is organized around that. Whereas in the patriarchy, you have a triangle with nature at the bottom, and then children, and then women, and then former colonies, like not in that order, I wouldn't say. But you have white men at the top, basically the 1% that are now ruling and ruining the world at the top. And power flows from the bottom to the top. In matriarchy, you don't have that. It's consensus-based. It's community-based. I find this idea so interesting, and I want to challenge all of you to think beyond the patriarchal box of somebody has to dominate. I really think we need to get away from this idea of, oh, you don't have every single question that I have for you answered, and allow ourselves to dream a little bit and to come up with an alternative that is not perfect, and sit together and work on it to become better. Because the way that the world is going now, guys, we can't continue like this. What are we doing? I mean, there's so much harm. The amount of suffering that women and nature and children have to endure, that is not a world that I want to live in. And so if finding an alternative means I have to be a little bit crazy and look at alternatives that are so far out there that at the first time hearing them, they seem utopian and unrealistic, well, I think exploring them as a valid option is far more needed than just saying, oh no, that's impossible, and sticking with what we have now. because it's not natural. It is not inevitable. I repeat, patriarchy has existed for 3% of our time. And obviously, I know we can't just go back to living in our small little communities. We're over 8 billion people now. But the idea is still with us. And I'm a firm believer that in order for us to change the world, we don't even need to come up with anything new. We just need to remember that feeling of warmth, of love, of partnership, and find a way to translate that into today's structures and today's infrastructure and how we live. So if that is something that interests you, I invite you to follow this podcast. Follow me on Instagram and Substack and Upscrolled, and make sure you leave a comment, leave a question. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to have books that you can recommend. I'd love to get your feedback on Instagram. Get in touch, send a DM, please. And if you could, I would love, love, love for you to please subscribe to this podcast. Give it a rating if you'd like it. That really, really helps me push it out there into the world. And send this episode to a friend who you think might be interested in this. Thank you so much. And I really, really believe a better world is possible. So I hope you'll join me in figuring out how we can build it. Thank you and take care.